Let's take an early look at a mid-air collision that happened recently in Watsonville, California. Once again, we see a mid-air between an aircraft that's in the pattern, executing touch and goes, and an aircraft entering the pattern at high speed. You can see from the animation we've developed here how the accident unfolded. We do want to caveat, we don't have a complete data set for this animation. This is our projection of the Cessna 152's flight path based on the collision and based on communications that we could get from liveatc.net. We do have a good data set from the Cessna 340, so that comes from actual ADSB data. Take a look at this animation to see how the accident happened.
Watsonville area traffic, Twin Cessna 740 Whiskey Juliet, 10 miles east. Presently we're at 4500. After the last ridge, we'll descend for a straight in for 20, Watsonville.
Watsonville traffic, Cessna 931, left cross 120, Watsonville. Watsonville traffic, Cessna 931, turning left downwind 20, Watsonville.
Watsonville area traffic, Twin Cessna 740 Wichita Juliet, 3 miles straight in, 20, full stop, Watsonville.
Watsonville traffic, Cessna 931, turning left base 20, Watsonville.
Watsonville area traffic, Twin Cessna 740 Whiskey Juliet, 1 mile straight in, 20, full stop. Looking for traffic on left base.
Yeah, I see you. You're behind me. I'm gonna go around then, because you're coming at me pretty quick, man.
Everybody, please be advised there is an accident towards runway 20. Please be advised, Watsonville.
From that animation, we can see that both pilots are aware of each other. The twin pilot calls the 10-mile call and the 3-mile call. The 152 pilot is making standard calls in the pattern. And yet, they continue to converge with neither pilot altering their course or taking evasive action. This is where the investigation is likely going to focus. One of the areas of interest is the speed of the twin. Looking at ADSB tracks and assuming that speed is correct, the twin never gets below about 179 knots all the way through the accident. Even as close as 3-mile final and 1-mile final, he's calling straight in with a full stop, and yet his speed is some 179 knots, and a typical approach speed would be somewhere around 90 to 95 knots. In fact, we went back and looked at previous tracks of that airplane, and on short final, on average, the plane is around 95 knots for final approach speed. So it's a curious element of this accident, why the twin was so fast coming into the pattern. And that kind of speed coming into a VFR pattern is certainly ill-advised. In the case of the 152 and inside that cockpit, the pilot is obviously aware of the twin coming in. On his base call, the twin pilot has already called 3 miles. In fact, the twin calls 3 miles and the 152 calls a left base. As a general rule, it's a bad idea, regardless of priority and traffic preference, to turn final inside traffic that's inside of 3 miles. Anytime traffic is inside of 5 miles, we should be careful, and we should just avoid turning inside of any traffic that's at 3 miles. The Cessna turns final, and we're not sure whether he has visual or whether he's picking the traffic up on ADSB in. Either way, there's a communication where you can hear the 152 pilot say, "You're coming up rapidly on me, I'm just going to go around." He executes the go around. By visual estimates, it was at about 200 feet that the airplanes collide, so somewhere in that range. The 152 pilot attempts a go around, attempts to move to the right side of the runway, but he's collided with by the Cessna 340, the twin that's coming in at such high speed. However this accident unfolds and whatever the NTSB finds, it's a good accident to bring up the discussion around traffic pattern entry and traffic pattern priority. So the only real guidance we have about traffic patterns is that, as far as preference and priority goes, is that when 2 aircraft are approaching a runway, the lower aircraft has priority. In this case, it's unclear. First of all, the 152 is already in the pattern, so he's not really approaching. but the Cessna 152 is lower than the twin. Now there is some other guidance that also says that traffic on final has priority over other traffic. The gray area here is, what do you define as a final? 1 mile, 3 mile, 5 mile? Can you be on a 10-mile final and have priority? That's always been a gray area in general aviation. In general, we should just consider that we make our calls, we listen, and we establish deconfliction early. And that's probably the biggest lesson that will come out of this accident. And that is, both pilots could see a conflict developing, and it appears that neither took action aggressively enough to avoid a collision. The 152 pilot attempts so, but attempts so late that he's unable to avoid the collision. And the lesson for all of us is that when you see any kind of conflict developing, take action early. Another lesson that comes out of this is the FAA recommends that VFR traffic enter the pattern in a standard pattern entry, that is 45 degrees to the downwind. They allow for straight-in approaches for things like coming off an IFR approach, but they're really kind of exceptions. If you read between the lines, that's really what it's implying. And in this case, the 340, it appears, was flying VFR. If the ADSB data is correct, he flew over en route at 6,500 feet. It's only about a 65 to 70 mile trip for him. He stays VFR and does a high-speed VFR descent into the pattern in a straight-in. That kind of approach, being fast and coming straight in to a pattern that already has traffic flying VFR patterns, is not recommended. It's a much better approach to establish a standard pattern entry for the reasons that this accident brings up. The whole idea of conflict and establishing our deconfliction. The importance of establishing these standardized procedures for entering the pattern is reinforced with our accident numbers for midairs. On average, in general aviation, we have about 6 midairs a year. About 4 of those midairs are fatal. And the midairs happen in conditions much like this one did and the one that we talked about previously in Las Vegas. Clear weather. In this case, the winds were right down the runway at about 9 knots. Visibility was 10 miles or more. And some 50% of midair collisions happen inside the traffic pattern, and 80% of those happen with an aircraft on final. We made the point in our last video about belly checks when you're coming off of an extended turn or when you're turning from base to final. That belly check is any time that you're making a turn from base to final, just making one final check that final approach is clear and there's nobody coming in that will be a conflict before you go belly up and turn on your final approach. So those belly checks may or may not have been a factor in this accident. It doesn't appear as if it was, but it's just a good habit to get into when you're on base. Before you turn final, take a quick belly check to make sure that area is going to be clear. There's a lot more to learn about this accident as it unfolds and the NTSB investigation materializes. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching.